Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, your co-host. My colleague Rowena Itchan is traveling this week. This week we're pleased to present a special recording of our Earth Day webinar featuring scholars and policy experts exploring key green topics being debated and discussed in Washington and in the States. We'll talk about everything from cap and trade and gas and carbon taxes to green appliance mandates. We'll also share the results of PRI's latest study called The Cost of Going Green, which details just how much the green transition in California will cost you. We also talk about how Washington's recent power shift is affecting policies ranging from taxpayer-funded electric vehicle subsidies to green energy mandates. And we have a terrific panel with us, including PRI's Dr. Wayne Winegarden and Todd Myers from the Washington Policy Center. We hope you enjoy our presentation. Just released from Encounter Books, read the new book from PRI's Sally Pipes, The World's Medicine Chest, available now at your favorite online bookstore. The World's Medicine Chest explores how America became the world's leader in biopharmaceutical innovation through market capitalism. But as Sally Pipes writes, America is the last best hope for millions around the world who are battling rare diseases and chronic conditions. As you'll read in the World's Medicine Chest, we can do more to fight and cure disease, but only if we continue to embrace private sector innovation over government regulation. Buy the World's Medicine Chest today at Amazon.com or your favorite online bookseller. You know, Earth Day, or now, as we were just saying before we started, alternatively now celebrated as Earth Week, typically focuses on the planet. And I thought it was interesting, there was a new survey that came out yesterday from Scott Rasmussen, and he asked voters, for what's your awareness of Earth Day or Earth Week? And despite all the hubbub, only 52% of voters even knew that Earth Day is being celebrated this month. And in fact, just 12% of the voters he surveyed considered it to be one of our nation's most important holidays. In fact, 40% consider it to be one of our least important. But I think that you'll see today, right? There may be some in your community you may have read about, all the different events being held across the country featuring, our most famous environmentalists discussing how ending the use of fossil fuels and living our lives in a more primitive manner, is imperative to protecting the climate and preventing the implosion of the planet. But, not surprisingly, these experts neglect to discuss how expensive their proposals are on the working class, both in California and across the country. Now, we here at PRI and the speakers that you're going to hear today share a great concern for our planet's health, and we believe in being wise stewards of the environment. But where we part company with our friends in the environmentalist community is they're always focused on limits. We need to end the use of fossil fuels. We need to impose massive carbon taxes. They're also always focused on government mandates. The government's going to dictate what kind of car you must drive and what kind of appliances you must use. And, we're going to legislate out of existence whole industries that provide good paying jobs for many. And, as we've shown in our research, and as Todd, our other speaker, has shown in his research, the limits they propose have shown themselves to be not particularly effective in lowering emissions. Now, we know the best way to protect the environment on our planet is incentivizing innovation, not imposing the kinds of new taxes or burdensome mandates that we're going to talk about today. And so we have two terrific experts with us today to share their thoughts on Earth Day. And first, I want to introduce Todd Myers, a friend of PRI's. He's a vice president for research at PRI's sister free market think tank in Washington State, the Washington Policy Center. We do a lot of terrific work with them in many different areas. And Todd has more than 2 decades of research in environmental policy, including on climate policy and forest health and salmon recovery. He's a former member of the executive team at the Washington Department of Natural Resources, and he's the author of a terrific book I highly recommend called Time to Think Small, which really focuses on small innovations often made by one individual, can really solve our planet's biggest environmental problems. Our other speaker here, again, that I always say, I don't know where he finds time in the day to do all of these things, but is our PRI's Dr. Wayne Weingarten, our senior fellow in business and economics. And Wayne, if you follow him, writes extensively on free market environmental policy, and he's authored or co authored many studies documenting how costly and ineffective California's government green mandates are. And today, in conjunction with our webinar and with Earth Day, we're so pleased to be releasing Wayne's latest study, which he um, co-authored with our Kerry Jackson, is called The Cost of Going Green. And you can get it right now. You can go to pacificaresearch.org. It's the main thing on our site when you click there. And it documents how much the green energy transition is going to cost Californians in the coming years. And we're going to talk about Wayne's a new study in a few minutes. Now, this isn't going to be just all of us talking. We want to get your questions. We want to make you part of our discussion. So if you have any questions for our great speakers today, somewhere kind of in the middle there at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. Go in the Q&A box throughout the discussion today. Leave your questions, and I'll do my best to moderate and ask as many of those questions throughout our webinar today. So, as we start today, let's start with a question for both Todd and Wayne. And we're starting our discussion from our vantage point here in Sacramento, which has never met a government green mandate that it hasn't liked. And as I write about in my book, The California Left Coast Survivor's Guide, what Gavin Newsom calls the California way, the government knows best style of policymaking, it's spreading beyond the Sierra Nevadas and it's influencing environmental policy in a bad way, not only in California or in Washington state, from where Todd hails, but in red and blue states alike nationwide. So, from your vantage points, what are some of the most misguided environmental policies emanating from California that other states should really be aware of? And maybe let's start with Todd on this one.
Yeah, thanks. It's really nice to be here. One of the things that I want to start with, though, is that people often think it's strange when I constantly remind conservatives about Earth Day because they associate it, obviously, with sort of a left-wing political viewpoint. But if you look at a map and you look at where the nature is and where the wilderness areas are, those are the areas that tend to be more conservative. And if you look at the areas of the country where we have paved over nature, those are the areas where the environmentalists, ironically, tend to hang out. And so conservatives and people on the right need to be more proud of the environment and say so. And not just because, they live it. We don't celebrate Earth Day one day, we celebrate Earth Day every day, but because the left's approach often fails. And I'll give you one example that we're dealing with right now in Washington state that has come out of California, and that is the Advanced Clean Cars law, which is the electric vehicle mandate. So next year, 35% of new car sales in Washington state need to be electric or plug-in hybrid. Even though Washington state has a very high level of adoption of EVs, we are still very far from that. And what it's going to do is make cars more expensive, make cars harder to get. And there's some flexibility in that. And what they say is, oh, that's okay because they can buy credits from other companies who are overfilling and things like that. But literally, early this morning, the Washington state legislature passed a tax on credits used to comply with that law. Interestingly, that law only applies to one company, Tesla. So the company that has done best at meeting the goals of the Washington state legislature that they say they want, which is selling electric vehicles, now, because they've been too successful, get taxed. And I think that is sort of emblematic of why Washington state, in particular, and other states that follow this very top-down government-heavy approach, end up missing so many of their targets. Because when push comes to shove, the policies are more about politics, government, and taxes than they are about delivering environmental results. And I think this is a perfect example of where the company that did the best job at achieving what the legislature claimed it wanted is now getting punished because it did too good a job of delivering the environmental results.
The other irony, of course, is, as we're tariffs are front and center in our discussion on just about everything. Teslas, ironically, I believe, are the most made in America car.
Yeah, I don't know if they are the most, but they certainly are up there. There's no doubt.
Wayne, your
And
your
what's really,
thoughts on all of these issues?
oh no, I love what Todd was saying because Milton Friedman said it best. There's different ways you can spend money, and the worst way is for one entity to spend other people's money, and that's exactly what Washington and California, they're all doing. He said that, oh, you can spend more money and it'll be okay, and that's a big part. Before we get into policies, I think that mindset being exported from California, I think that's one of the largest issues. We come out very much saying we know what that energy transition that must occur, and we know how to do it. We just need the will to do it, which means, of course, we need to overcome the special interests that are obstructing kind of the direction that we need to go. And of course, the problem is that no part of that mindset is actually true. We don't actually know what type of the energy infrastructure should look like, not just this year, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now. We need a lot more innovation. And so by actually forcing kind of the less efficient technologies that we have today and demanding from the government what that should be, we're really setting ourselves up for not just economic issues, not just energy reliability issues, but there are important environmental implications that are actually not good stewards of the environment, as Todd was saying, that we're really setting ourselves up. And to me, this is really kind of summarized in the zero electricity generation mandates, where we cannot, not even spend enough money. We just can't generate the reliable electricity we need in California with the current technology as it exists. And yet we're just, not only is California barreling ahead, but because other states can adopt our policies, we're seeing it flourish in New England, in Washington, and even in Texas, where they have all of these wind resources, and that now is destabilizing the grid there. So I think just this idea that the energy infrastructure, that we know what it is and that we need to push it, is causing a lot of damage that it's going to be hard to recover from.
So there's the other side of this question too, right? And that's, you have the second Trump administration, since they've come in, they're kind of positioning themselves, well, really almost as the mirror opposite of California when it comes to, embracing free market environmental policies. And we at PRI, we've been so pleased to see our former board member, Chris Wright, appointed as Secretary of Energy, and all the really terrific work that he's doing to promote American energy leadership. So, from your perspectives, what should the Trump administration's top priorities be when it comes to leading from these principles of abundance and innovation on energy and environmental policy? Maybe let's start with Wayne on this one.
I'm glad you started with me, because Todd would probably steal my answers and I wouldn't know what to say. Well, I mean, the first thing we should do is repeal the tariffs. You talked about that earlier, and there's all sorts of economic damage the tariffs are doing. But one of the impacts is it's making it harder for oil and natural gas companies to explore and develop oil. And so getting rid of the tariffs would actually help strengthen kind of the fossil fuel industry itself. But kind of directly with environmental policy, I mean, the first thing we should do is there's all sorts of support for solar, wind, all sorts of alternative energy projects that the Biden administration passed. And there's still tens or hundreds of billions of dollars that is waiting to be spent. And we need to rescind that money. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars. It's propping up these solar and wind technologies, not only to the detriment of other approaches, but they're just not working, and they're creating all sorts of other costs. So getting rid of those subsidies, getting rid of the investment tax credit, and the production tax credit, again, subsidizing wind and solar undeservedly. That's something we need to look at. And just the idea that California can set these stricter standards when it comes to electric vehicles or all of these other issues. I know this goes back a long way, but the idea that California is beginning to set the environmental policy for the entire country. And if you throw in Washington, you throw in New England, you're getting a few states take the EV mandate, right? If New York, New England, Washington, and California all have these EV standards, it becomes very difficult for car companies to actually meet those demands without selling fewer internal combustion engine cars. And so you're actually harming the profitability and the ability of companies to sell ICE cars to other states, which means de facto California is setting the national environmental policy. And that really needs to change. If California wants to go one way, it's fine if we don't impact other states. But when we start impacting what other states can do, you really have kind of go beyond what state policy should be doing.
Yeah, and let me pick up on that. I think you make a great point, which is the first thing that the Trump administration should do is sort of take the Hippocratic Oath, which is first do no harm. Get rid of a lot of these bad subsidies, expenditures, regulations, things like that are making it hard to generate electricity, generate energy, those sorts of things. Be, energy independent. I'm a little bit, I'm skeptical of energy independence. I think we should trade. I agree with Wayne. But I mean, we should generate, we should, create as much of our own energy as is economically feasible. And there's been a lot of limits on that. But then the question is, okay, so once you do that, once you undo the bad stuff that has been done, what next? Because then there's the danger, of course, that we go right back to that, which is what happened after the first Trump administration when Biden came in. And that, I think, is where we can do a better job this time, which is to take more power out of the hands of Washington, D.C. and out of these big states and put it into the hands of individuals. And that's what my book is about. Time to Think Small is about giving power to individuals, which makes it harder for government to either do things quietly and then blame others, or to take power away. I'll give you one example. When I ask people what a gallon of gas costs, everybody can tell me within 10 cents a gallon. But if I ask them how much a kilowatt hour costs, they don't even know what a kilowatt hour is. So just simply giving you transparency in your costs and giving more people control over how they pay for electricity, then they see it. Then they get used to say, oh, okay, electricity costs more during peak hours, things like that. If I can wash my dishes late at night or dry my clothes during the middle of the day, as opposed to during peak hours, I can save money. But even more important is that it shows the impact of taxes and regulation, and they can see when gas taxes go up, everybody knows because everybody sees the impact immediately. One of the reasons that we have so many bad regulations on electricity and in other energy areas is because people have a hard time seeing the cause and effect, and politicians are quick to blame big oil or utilities or other things like that. Simply giving transparency and giving people more information, and we now have the technology to do that, to make it easy, helps avoid that. So step one, what Wayne said, get rid of these bad regulations and bad restrictions and subsidies, but to make it harder for the next administration simply to go back to where we were, give people power, give people information, because they don't want to give it back. And if politicians try to take it away, people resist that. So that's how you can make this sustainable for the long term, not just for the environment, but just in a sense that you can sustain it over the long run.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week. So, Wayne, let's turn to your new study, The Cost of Going Green, which we're pleased to release just this morning, and which again, you can, anyone watching can go to pacificresearch.org and download a copy of the study to review. It's right there on the main page. You can't miss it. That paper, though, it's really the third in a series of studies that you've either authored or co-authored, quantifying the costs and the real life impacts of the California's costly green agenda on real people. And before we get into the new paper, I thought, especially given that it's Earth Day, maybe we should go back a little bit and remind our viewers today of some of the findings from your first two papers in the series. And those two papers, remember, covered, how much are green energy mandates costing Californians on their electric bills, and how much these policies are impacting the power grid. So, Wayne, could you give us a little step back for a moment before we talk about your new paper today?
Well, you just summarized them perfectly. So in the first paper, and I have to give Tim credit for the creative titles, we called it Zapped. And what we will, one of the things you consistently hear about is, oh, solar is cheaper than natural gas or coal or nuclear, and same for wind. And of course, the question is then, if these alternative energy sources are cheaper, then why do prices keep going up the more of these technologies you use? Of course, the obvious answer is because it's not cheaper. And so in Zapped, what we wanted to do was really start quantifying that. And what we found was that in California, as of 2020, you're talking about between $1,500 and $2,000 was the average annual expenditures for households in California. And that was about 56% higher than the US average. And we found that if you brought some reforms in and you could save up to over $500 a year, just kind of bringing back the regulations in California to the average. So we found that there's significant savings potential for households because our energy policies are pushing up costs. The next question we wanted to ask is, well, is this revolution in our energy system, is it even feasible? And that was what we were looking at, is in Sapping California's Energy Future. That was the title of the piece. And what we tried to do is we said, okay, these are the technologies you want us to build, and this is the rate that we've been historically able to put these online. And so we're asking the question, just using the electric vehicle mandate. So we didn't include all of the kind of electric stoves and heaters and all those other appliances that we want to turn into electric. And we didn't actually take into account artificial intelligence. It really wasn't as big of an issue back then. So we just had the electric vehicle mandates. We allowed consumption to grow as per normal. And we said, if past is prologue and we can put online in the future what we've done in the past, because we've been emphasizing it. So, and we've been doing it for enough years that it would make sense. This is our capacity to do it. And we also didn't worry about something very important, which is balancing the grid. And what that means is exactly what Todd was just talking about, right? When you flip the switch in your home, you expect the light to turn on. Well, in order for that to happen, you have to be able to provide the electricity at that moment. And the demand differs across the times of days. We didn't worry about that. We just said, will you have enough generation in order to kind of meet the demand? And even on that irrational low kind of expectation, we would be 21.2% short of the need. So in other words, doing what we're going to do in terms of shutting down all of the natural gas and closing our nuclear power plants, trying to build up all of the solar and wind and other battery type of alternative energy, you're not going to even be able to generate enough electricity to do our current consumption and our electric vehicle mandates, which ultimately means that we're going to have all sorts of rationing. The grid's going to be unstable going down, and it's going to be not just an economic problem, but really a life-saving issue too.
So the new study out today, The Cost of Going Green, explores the costs that will be borne by Californians in the coming years as the state transitions to an all renewable energy infrastructure. Now, I can sense our viewers are holding onto their wallets as you're prepared to deliver a terrible estimate to them. So give us the bad news. Just how expensive will transitioning to an all green future be for Californians?
Yeah, it's going to be very expensive. Again, we were only able to do a partial accounting, and what we did, as opposed to looking at how we've done it in the past, we said let's pretend we can build the infrastructure. What is that going to cost? And what we said is, okay, what's the cost of building the alternative energy infrastructure? What's the cost of solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, batteries? We also said, what's the cost of decommissioning and dismantling all this disfavored nuclear and natural gas? Because these are perfectly good resources. We're just disposing of them because we don't like them anymore. And we also asked, well, wind turbines and solar panels, they wear out. So what's the cost of disposing that infrastructure once it wears out? Just taking into account those factors, it's going to cost between 232 and 269 billion dollars. That's a present value over the next 20 years to build that infrastructure. In more human terms, it means between about $17,400 and $20,100 per household in California. So basically, if every household took $20,000, put it in the bank today at a 2.5% return, we would have enough money to build out all of these desired energy infrastructure. And this, by the way, this cost excludes the lost opportunity cost, right? Money spent building new solar panels can't be used to fireproof the current transmission lines. Doesn't include the cost of stranding assets, right? We're taking perfectly good facilities and shutting it down. Doesn't take into account all the new transmission infrastructure. So this is a low conservative estimate, and even that is just very, very expensive.
So, Todd, as Wayne has documented in his work in California, these government green mandates are not only have huge cost burdens on consumers and businesses alike, but they aren't particularly effective in meeting the environmental goals of the proponents, right? Now, I know you've been writing a lot about how Washington's green mandates, many of which are similar to California, certainly been inspired by California's, aren't really particularly effective in lowering emissions. So what has your research found, and what do proponents say when they're asked why the green mandates they say are essential to saving the planet aren't really working?
Yeah, so I think that's the thing is that what happens whenever you bring up, oh, here's what the costs are, they say, oh, but we have to act, we have to reduce the risk of climate change, we have to make this transition, so it's worth it. So then I say, okay, let's see if it actually works. And one of the things that I point out is that in Washington State, over 12 years of Governor Inslee, now Governor Inslee ran for president as the climate candidate, right? This is his number one issue. And we only have data through the EPA through 2023, but Washington State's CO2 emissions went up literally every single year he was governor, except 2020 for COVID, obviously. So we spent all this regulation, this money, everything, and we didn't hit any of our goals. We went in the opposite direction. And the reason is that when push comes to shove, the policies that are proposed are more about ideology and politics than they are about environmental results. I'll give you an example from last year. So Washington has a new cap and trade system, much like California. And so we have billions of dollars that we're spending on purportedly green projects. Last year, there was a $45 million rebate for electric vehicles. And the purpose was to allow people who are middle income to be able to purchase EVs that they couldn't have afforded otherwise. So after the subsidy ran out, I downloaded all of the car sales in Washington State to see what was the impact. And what we found was that the equivalent for the $45 million spending in terms of CO2 reductions, we reduced Washington State's transportation-related CO2 emissions by a maximum of 0.03%. And just to put it in human terms, we calculated that it was basically like spending more than $1,000 for a latte, right? I come from the land of Starbucks, so we put everything in terms of lattes. So more than $1,000 for a latte, completely wasteful. And yet, in the budgets that they are now considering, guess what? They were looking at spending another $40 million on this project. And so when one of the proponents of this program was asked, what do you say about this? He says, well, how can we know? We haven't done the program yet. People haven't driven the cars. Well, so the irony is that I used the exact same calculator the state of Washington used to estimate the impact. It was from the EPA, and that's where I got the 0.03%. So when confronted with the failure of their own programs, there's no incentive for them to learn, right? Politicians don't like to admit that they were wrong. And if you cared about climate change, if you thought climate change was truly an existential crisis, you would demand that every dollar get the maximum amount of environmental benefit. But in the real world, we don't see that. I'll give you one more example. Washington's budget that they're proposing right now has $2 million for studies that look at offshore floating wind turbines. Floating wind turbines are some of the most expensive forms of electricity there are, but $500,000 of that just happened to be funneled directly to an organization in Seattle that is headed by Jay Inslee's former maritime advisor. So that when you look at how they spend the money on things that don't work, that don't deliver results, and are more about politics and cronyism than they are the environment. And that's why I keep telling people, I think too often people on the right are afraid to talk about the environment. They talk about the costs, but we need to talk more about what works, because markets not only work to create prosperity, they also work to help the environment. And so that's the one thing that we always need to remember, is not just to talk about the costs, but the fact that the other side stuff doesn't work.
Wayne, your new study documents some of the challenges that Todd just mentioned with wind generation, and particularly here in California in our coastline. So, can you share with our viewers some of the problems that you found in your research?
Absolutely, and kind of building off of what Todd just said in terms of taking on their proposals head on. Offshore wind is allegedly the most reliable of the wind sources. Supposedly you can get more energy building these wind turbines offshore. But there's all sorts of evidence that this is disrupting marine life, and especially whales. And so if you care about the oceans, right, and one of the justifications of why we have to act, why is this an emergency, and it doesn't matter what the cost is, we have to address these issues now, is because what's happening to the oceans. But if we're building offshore wind turbines that are disrupting the oceans, you think you would take a step back and say, okay, what's the actual cost? What's the actual benefits? And what's interesting related to what Todd was just saying, the U.S. has seen emissions coming down. We peaked, I think it was 2005, I think is where we peaked. And it's been coming down to about 7% lower, even though our economy is much larger. And that's because of natural gas, right? So it used to be the favored resource of the environmentalists. Now it's vilified, but it's actually a fossil fuel is a big part of the reason why our emissions have gone down. If you going directly what you were asking though, Tim, in terms of offshore wind, especially here in California, we have a coastline that's really not very conducive to using offshore wind. There's a steep drop, which means you need to use either these flotation type of technologies that are costly, or you've got to go down really deep, which becomes expensive and again disruptive to the oceans. So we're not really conducive to kind of doing this or having this offshore wind. But it's again, it's the favored resource, and I think that's why Todd's sense of going small is so important, because individuals learn, right? Individuals have different ideas, they experiment. We learn from failures. And one of the big problems we have with state government and federal government is that you don't learn from your failures. If we learned from our failures, we would not be building more offshore wind. It's too expensive, it's too dangerous, it doesn't make sense. One of the things we document in our paper is in Cape Cod, a huge wind turbine, the blades shattered, fell into the ocean. You couldn't fish, you couldn't use the beach. I mean, it was a disaster. So much so that fishermen were getting in their boats and having protests because of the environmental damage caused by a windmill. You know, governments don't learn, individuals do. And that's why I think the going small is such a brilliant strategy in getting it away from the government, because we're going to continue, we're demonstrating, we're continuing to invest in these less efficient, more costly technologies that don't help the environment.
So let's pick up on those themes. I have a question from Renee, one of our viewers today, and you know, she makes the point, if these existing policies don't work, what are some of the things that we can do? And she suggests, what about something like, say, regenerative agriculture to sequester more carbon in the soil? Maybe Todd, you have some thoughts on that, especially, given the themes of your book, Time to Think Small.
Yeah. So yeah, I think what we have found in the case of regenerative agriculture is that farmers are learning how to. And it's not just about sequestering carbon, although when given a choice of like various strategies to store carbon, like it's one of the least expensive and most effective ways to do it. There's lots of other crazy ideas about how to store or remove carbon. Regenerative actually works because what happens is you get strong roots, and the roots are where you sequester that carbon. And so we've actually found the ability to have better soil and also have better crops. You have more nutrients in it. But like, it works for some and not for others. And that's the thing is that too often you get these top-down approaches. You say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do regenerative agriculture. And it works for some crops and not others. And what you really need to do is to allow individuals to make the choices that are best for them. One of the other challenges is sometimes it takes new capital equipment. You have to have better, or different types of equipment, and that costs money. So, one of the things people come to me all the time and they say, what about this cool technology or this cool technology? And I say, that sounds great. And it's probably great for these people, but may not be great for these. But if you can let each individual person determine what's best, and then as Wayne said, they find out, yes, this worked for me. This didn't really work for me. I did a study a long time ago about green schools and green buildings. And there was a mandate in Washington State. And what I found was, ironically, that green schools ended up using more energy than the non-green schools in the same district, because it was a cookie cutter, sort of one size fits all approach. And so I started going state to state, and then I did the analysis in New Mexico, and I found that in the Santa Fe school district was the first place that I'd found that the green schools were actually better. So I called the facilities director and I said, congratulations, you are the only facilities director in the country who's been able to make these work. And what she said is, yeah, but we're not going to build anymore because we figured out what parts work and what parts don't. So the next building we're going to build won't meet the green building standards, but it'll be even more efficient because we don't have to do the things that are wasteful. That's the process that really works, and that's how you do it. So, in the case of regenerative agriculture, there's a lot of promise in that. But what we need to do is to let the farmers decide when it works and when it doesn't, rather than bureaucrats in Sacramento, Olympia, or Washington, D.C.
I would also recommend following the work of our friend, one of Todd's colleagues at Washington Policy Center, Pam Lewison, who's a multi-generation farmer. She writes for us about agriculture issues, including topics like this, and you can follow those in our Right by the Bay blog. She writes a couple of pieces a month for her, but for us. But she really provides that perspective of as a farmer, these are how these various policies affect her and affect people who are actually in the field doing it. So
And I can say that Pam knows what she's doing because I have a large amount of beef that she raised in my freezer, and it's delicious.
I need to put in my request to Pam. I didn't realize she sends good beef to her favorite colleagues, but. We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. Question, maybe this is a good one for Wayne. This is from our friend Linda, who's watching in Arizona, and she, kind of asks, um, Arizona's kind of a purplish state, but these, as we've mentioned, these kind of bad ideas that we talk about are spreading across the country, and you know, regardless of what the Trump administration wants to do, a lot of these policies are being passed at the state legislative level or at the city and local level. And so, what's your advice to people living in other states where these ideas are catching on? How can they push back? What are the things that they should be pushing for? I would say, of course, the most important thing is follow Wayne's work, follow PRI, where you'll get the facts and you'll get the data that you can push back on these policies.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is, follow Todd, right? I think there's a lot of good information that's out there. And the more we take solar power farms, right? We were talking about, how do we sequester carbon? Well, one of the things we found in our research is that you get these huge solar farms, and usually you have to locate them in the right place. Well, some of the right places are very good cropland, right? Because the same kind of attributes that make it good farmland is also making it a good site for solar powers. Or you put it in the desert. Again, a great place for a solar farm is in the desert. But what we're finding is that the solar panels are actually creating issues where you had a carbon sink and it's been disrupted. And so you're actually having that kind of feedback effect that's reducing the quote unquote emissions reduction because of kind of the disturbance to the desert from the solar farms. You have to remember solar power, especially, but wind as well, they have very large footprints. One of the ways you measure energy is its intensity. A nuclear power plant requires very, very few acres relative to a solar farm. So you're disrupting a much larger land area. And in fact, that actually has environmental consequences. I think the point to the question, though, is that this type of information is not out there. And I think the more that we get this information out there, the more that we talk about it, the more that legislators are this is brought up, eventually you have to address it. You have to deal with it. Right now, very much the strategy is just ignore it, or the issue of global climate change is so important that nothing else matters. Todd was talking about that earlier. Who cares about the cost? The world's going to explode. And if the earth was going to explode, I guess that would make sense, but that's not the case. And so we need to bring rationality to the discussion. We need to bring actually facts in terms of what's actually happening and what's not actually happening. Electric vehicles, there's a lot of evidence that would question whether or not on net you're ever really reducing emissions. You certainly, if you did a cost benefit, you're not going to see a very effective way of reducing emissions. Even if you do, remember, every time you take an electric vehicle and you finish building it, if you compare that to a gas powered car, you have a what they call a greenhouse gas deficit because it takes so much more emissions to build the electric vehicle. We're now discovering that EVs, because they're so heavy, that you get a lot more particulate pollution from the tires and then the degradation of the tires and the highway. That's creating particle pollution, which could be bad for your health, but also bad for the environment. So when you take all of these factors into account, the fact that an electric vehicle isn't going to go as long as the kind of stated life cycle of it. If you take your iPhone or your Google phone, right, the battery degrades over time. Same thing happens to electric vehicles. So getting all this type of information out there to push back and to say we need a responsible environmental policy, absolutely. But this is not it. And this is not about global climate change. This is about the ineffectiveness of that policy. And I think the more we frame it like that, the more we frame that your policy fails on its own standards and is costly and harms people, the more we frame the discussion like that and get that out there, then we have the possibility of really getting productive environmental policy done.
Another idea that's come up, and I know Todd has written about this, is this idea of a carbon tax. And we don't want to give Sacramento legislators any idea, but it's something that voters in Washington state have approved. And Todd, maybe this is an example where you can warn California what we might have in store for us if a carbon tax was pursued. What are the cost burdens on Washington consumers and business from the carbon tax, and why would it be a mistake for other states to embrace these? Found it interesting. Your neighbor to the north, Canada, for all the controversy surrounding that, I don't think they've met a government green mandate they haven't liked. They've decided to throw in the towel and go away from a carbon tax model. So, share with our viewers here what you found on the carbon tax and what you're experiencing in Washington.
Yeah, well, Washington State 2 years ago adopted a CO2 cap and trade system, very much like California's. In fact, we're looking to join California and Quebec in our cap and trade market. As you say, Canada, nationwide, they got rid of their national carbon tax and immediately gas prices went down the equivalent of about 70 cents a gallon in places like Alberta. They didn't go down in Quebec because Quebec has a separate carbon tax, but in places like Alberta where they got rid of it, prices went down. And so when that tax was going into effect, when it was starting in 2023, Washington and Oregon's gas prices were virtually identical. And so I predicted that prices would go up about 40 cents a gallon. The Washington State Department of Ecology and the governor told me that I was an idiot. I didn't know what I was talking about. I was very simplistic. And in fact, the governor was asked about it and said, oh, well, it'll be pennies. It won't have much of an impact. And then that summer, in 2023, we did something that I'd never done before, which is we dethroned California as having the highest gas prices in the country because prices went up about 40 to 45 cents a gallon compared to Oregon, where we had been equal. So there's a very high cost. And what you're seeing with it that is that the way that they use that money, rather than rebate it, rather than say, look, we think that it's worth putting a price on CO2 emissions, things like that, but we just want to give an incentive to people to put in that price. Washington State simply said, no, we want to keep all the money. The taxes are what's important. Ironically, in 2016, Washington State had a revenue neutral carbon tax on the ballot, and Jay Inslee opposed it. What that means is that for the very people who say that climate change is important, that we need to put a price on it, when given a choice between putting a price on climate change and having more taxes, they chose more taxes. And so that's what our system is. And so that's where we're getting the money for a lot of these very silly expenditures. The other thing that was proposed this year in the legislative session is now a cap on the prices because the prices are consistently higher than was projected. Just in December, the Department of Ecology said, because prices are set at an auction, they said, oh, the prices won't go any higher than $48 a metric ton, which is about 40 cents a gallon. Well, in the very first auction of the year, they were at $50. So they consistently predict wrong. And I think that this is, the perfect example. These are folks who tell you, trust us. We can plan this very complex economic transition over the course of the next 25 years because we're the experts. We know what we're doing. They can't even predict prices 3 months in advance. That's the fundamental problem with these very complex systems of cap and trade, where you have favoritism and taxes and arbitrary caps and all these things, is that when push comes to shove, the claim that they can plan the economy decades out is disproven by the fact they can't even get the predictions accurate 3 months in advance. That's the real danger. So if you want to put a price, we do put prices on pollution, right? We used cap and trade systems to reduce sulfur dioxide, and it was effective at reducing acid rain. When you try to apply that to the entire economy and all energy in these complex systems, you run into many more problems. And I think that is the hubris of politicians to believe they can do that, is what ends up causing very high costs and very low environmental benefits.
And I think if I can pick up on that for a second, because what we said earlier is you need to tailor each policy kind of around what works at the time. Well, cap and trade and sulfur dioxide, that is a very different problem that is much more contained and much narrower compared to a carbon dioxide, which is much more pervasive and it's a completely different problem. And so one of the hubris that we have, and one of the problems is, you look at sulfur dioxide, look at that success, we can apply it to carbon dioxide. And it's a completely different issue, because carbon dioxide, the emissions are much more pervasive. They're you don't have that narrow focus that you did of really the smokestacks only with the sulfur dioxide. So I think that actually proves the point that Todd was saying earlier, which is we need to be careful of government regulations, because you need to be much more adaptive than what they seem to be able to do.
Just because they both have dioxide doesn't mean we could do the same.
Let's ask a few more of your questions in our final minutes here. So, Anonymous makes a good point, and good feedback on Wayne's research. Anonymous makes the point that there's 4 cars in every driveway. So, Anonymous argues we're underestimating what's needed to upgrade the entire electrical network. Anonymous argues, well, might need a 50 times increase to have a safe margin. And what army is doing this? And Wayne, I know, as we've talked, I always say you need a World War II level of production, and you're still not going to come anywhere close on these issues.
Right. Yeah. No, we have a huge kind of fixed asset base of cars. And so Anonymous is correct that just because you stop selling electric vehicles doesn't necessarily mean that you stop selling internal combustion cars, gas powered cars, doesn't mean that you don't have a lot on the road, doesn't mean that people aren't going to try to bring them in from other states, although licensing may become an issue. But yeah, absolutely. The stock of cars actually matters. But also, when you're talking about having 4 cars, there is a real issue that people don't bring up. If you're wealthy and you have a nice big single family home with a 2-car garage, it's very simple for you to spend, it's only $3,000, right? Whatever it is. So you can put the charger in your home, you've got the income, and you're fine, and you're charging up your 2 electric vehicles. Well, if you're a middle class family, especially in California, and then you live, let's say, in a garden style apartment that doesn't even have a parking lot, where are you charging up your car? Are you supposed to take it to a Target parking lot and charge it for 2 hours and I guess go shopping? I mean, there's all sorts of real issues in terms of how working class and middle income families are going to actually adhere to these mandates, let alone the cost. One of the things we put into the paper, despite what the advocates will say, yes, electric vehicles are going to cost less because typically, not everywhere, uh, you have gas is more expensive than the electricity. And let's assume that's true. That's not necessarily true. Assume that's true. You also have less maintenance on an EV. Assume that's true. The price premium of an electric vehicle compared to those savings, it's not financially worthwhile. So even beyond just those practical issues, it costs more to buy an electric vehicle. And given kind of how costly life is, it'd be a real difficult burden on millions of families if, in fact, we start enforcing these mandates. So there's also that if you have 4 cars and you're going to replace all 4 with electric vehicles, that's a net cost. And our guess has a net cost of probably $10,000-$12,000 on net over the lifetime of the car. Remember, lots of the savings are going to be in future years. So it's an upfront investment too. It's just too costly.
And I would encourage all of our viewers today, check out a recent column by our Matt Fleming, who has had an electric vehicle as a rental, and he shares his experiences, and they echo a lot of these things and more, but especially his car charging experiences are highly eye-opening. So recommend that. Check it out at the Orange County Register. Um, as we close, I have a question for both of you. We've of course talked a lot about our research. We've talked a lot about the challenges and the real issues facing us, but you know, we know that there are many great free market policies that can make a difference in environmental preservation and lowering emissions. So, from your individual vantage points, what are some of the most important free market reforms that policymakers, either in states like California or Washington or others, or Washington, D.C., what should they be pursuing to not only better achieve our environmental goals, but not impose these, ineffective policies that also are crushing people with high costs and huge government expenditures that we can't afford. So maybe let's start with Todd on this one.
Yeah, I think there's 3 things. And the first thing is give more power to local folks to make those decisions. We talked about farmers. I work a lot in salmon recovery. And what I find is that the people who know the best about what habitat, what changes need to be made to improve local salmon stocks are the people who are on the ground. Some of the best stewardship that you will see, both in terms of salmon and forests in Washington State, are done by native tribes on their reservation. Why? Because they feel the costs if they fail. If they don't, manage their forests well, they have forest fires. So they have the knowledge and they have the incentives to do it right. The second thing is that government needs to change the way it thinks about when it has an environmental challenge. Rather than just doing another study and another bureaucracy, it needs to think about how it can use the public and innovation to solve problems. I'll give you a great example. Washington State, we had the murder hornet, which was this really scary hornet that was huge. And killed bees. I wore my bee tie because I'm a beekeeper today for Earth Day. And so when we had the murder hornet, rather than doing studies and bureaucracy and things like that, what the state did is they said, well, let's work with beekeepers, let's work with the public to put up traps so that we can track where they are. And then when they found one, the University of Washington had developed a small tracker, very tiny technology that they literally glued to the hornet and then tracked it back to its nest. And then they were able to find the nest and eradicate it. But think about how different that is than the typical government approach to solving an environmental problem. Time was of the essence. And because time was of the essence, they knew that they couldn't just do it themselves. They had to engage the public, and they used technology. We should do more of that. And the result is that last year they announced that the murder hornet has been eradicated in Washington State. So these sort of solutions can work with local people, put power in their hands. And when government has a problem to solve, engage them. And lastly, focus on innovation because there's a lot, and transparency. There's a lot of things that we can do and be effective at if people know what's going on and have the tools. In the 1970s, the best way to solve problems was the EPA and the Clean Air Act. simply because those were the only tools we have. That's not true anymore. We now have technology. We now have, we've gone from a situation where nobody had technology, where now everybody's complaining about that they're on their phones too much. So we have lots of technology that empowers people to solve problems that we couldn't solve 50 years ago. Let's rely on that. That's what my book is about. And by giving people more power, you take power away from government. And so it becomes less about sort of the whims of individual politicians and the back and forth of elections, and more about the efforts of individuals that can be sustained over a long period of time. It took us a long time to cause some of these environmental problems. It's going to take us a long time to get out of it. And the only way to do that is to empower individuals.
Wayne, in the 2 minutes we have left, your suggestions for free market ideas we should be pursuing.
I'm going to just work off of what Todd just said because he's spot on. And one of the things that we've talked about, which really blends perfectly with that, is the idea repealing all of these cap and trade programs, all these subsidies, all of these tax giveaways, and instead focus on a tax reduction, right, or tax incentives based on reduction in carbon emissions. So you're empowering the private sector, individuals, companies that, if you come up with the technology that technologically neutral, right? It could be coal, could be natural gas, could be hydrogen, whatever it is. If you hit certain emissions targets, let's say your corporate profits are going to go untaxed for the first 10 years that you're operating. So you're providing, instead of the negative incentive of imposing taxes, you're using the tax systems to create a positive incentive. And what you're really doing is you're changing the relative return. You're increasing the relative return of investing in low emission technology. You're going to encourage more investment. Innovation is the key. And that's a great way to kind of incentivize more innovation.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.